The subject of our talk tonight is how should I live? Ethical philosophy today. So, to start with the obvious question, what is ethics? Julian?
Yeah, I hate the thing about philosophy is it's really embarrassing. Whenever you ask the most simple questions, they're the ones that are hardest to ask. You know, what is philosophy is the one that's hardest to answer of all. What is ethics is difficult. Various things, if you like. I mean, the way it's understood, if you study ethics, if you go to do a course or read a book in ethics, you'll find it's kind of systematic theorising about the way to live. But that actually has arguably very little to do with actually how people live and the values people have. I think a lot of people do have at least an implicit set of values and ethic they live by. But actually, if you look at why people choose the way of life that they do and why they hold the kind of moral values they do, I think it has very little to do with anything remotely systematic or philosophical. I mean, it's very interesting. I did something several years ago. It was a little internal training thing for the BBC, and we did vox pops for people in Hammersmith Market. You know, where do you get your moral values from? And, well, I don't know, well, what do you think the most popular answer would be for that? What do you think people would say? Anyone want to hazard a guess? No? Well, but parents, that's what we would say. It's my parents, my mum, my dad, that kind of thing. And there really wasn't much else to it than that. And I think that's kind of true, because I think when people talk about, you know, we might come on to talk about whether there's any kind of crisis or anything in ethics today. But, you know, what actually maintained the values in society previously? People talk about the church and the authority of the church and that kind of thing. And no doubt it did have some influence, but my suspicion, and I can only really call it a suspicion because I'm not really an anthropologist or anything like that, is that that's not actually true. What maintained values in society more than anything was that people generally lived in small communities where there wasn't a lot of mobility. And it was basically just other people. Everyone was constantly, you know, it's this whole thing that if you did something wrong, people would know about it, and that had consequences and so forth. So in practical terms, I think ethics has generally looked after itself by a process of social regulation, which is more or less self-governing. It's perhaps become more of an issue now because society has become more diverse and the communities are more fluid and so forth. So perhaps we now think the theoretical question is more important. Previously, perhaps only philosophers and academics thought the theoretical thing was important.
Yeah, I suppose I've got sort of two things to say, both of which I suppose echo what Julian just said. One is that the German philosopher Heidegger, who's spent his whole time trying to rethink things from the beginning, he said that once you started calling things ethics, once you'd given like a subject a name and given it a sort of category, it lost its meaning. So once you started talking about aesthetics rather than sort of being with art, then you'd lost what was important about the artwork. And once you started calling a method of inquiry ethics, you've lost what it was really going on about. So he wanted to go back from sort of philosophical term ethics, meaning a sort of area of inquiry, to the way he translated the original Greek word of ethos, meaning a sort of a home. The way that I guess sometimes companies use the word ethos, saying, you know, here's our ethos, here's our values. And so ethics, in a sort of bigger sense, means, you know, where we live, and those very deep ideas that sort of that shape how we see ourselves and how we behave ourselves, how we understand ourselves. And I guess that does come a lot from parents. So that's my first thought about, you know, what ethics is. Ethics is really, when we think about ethics, we think about everything all together. You know, in a sort of great, about who we are. It's like, I think it's the most important sort of thing. And I suppose my second point, and I guess, you know, I teach in an English department, is that it seems to me there are two sorts of things where we worry about ethics. Of course, we worry about it in our daily lives, about doing the right thing, what that right thing might be. The other thing, I think, we're also confronted all the time in artworks about very profound ethical questions. God, this sounds really prophecy. I don't watch soap operas, I've got two small children, I don't have time. But there was a whole ad campaign for EastEnders about 2 or 3 years ago when there was some terrible thing going on. And all the ads on the BBC was asking ethical questions. Should she do this? Was she right to do that? And I thought, like, you know, these ethical questions about how you behave are asked us all the time in artworks. I mean, in our daily life, but in artworks. And that seems to me to be another source where we're constantly, I mean, people obviously are going to be snobby about EastEnders, but constantly asking us these difficult ethical questions and asking us to respond to them. So it's all around us, I think.
Okay. So what do you think is our situation today? Is there, what kind of ethics, if any, is possible?
Well, I mean, do you want to go?
Well, that's a really hard question. Yeah. Well, I think I echo something Julian said about a sense of there being a phenomenal change in the world, a change, starting off somewhere, I don't know, when in the Renaissance, and getting faster and faster, and it constantly amazes me that it's quicker for me to get from here to Madrid than it would have been for Jane Austen to get from here to where I live in South London. It's an amazing thing, and that's all exciting. But by the same token, I also think that where I go to sleep every night, there are neighbours on either side of my house. So there's people sleeping 5 or 10 metres away from me. I guess there are a number of people sleeping, and I don't know their names. I know Elizabeth, who lives next door, but the neighbours on the other side, the ground floor flats, Carol, don't know the first floor flat, don't know the second floor flat. So there are people living right next to me who I don't know anything about them at all. And even 100 years ago, that would be really bizarre. Okay, so I think there's a weird change in society where, and this is what you're saying about everyone knowing you. We have this very, particularly in big cities, and 90% of people in Britain live in big cities. This increasingly atomised society, where issues of sort of shame, if you like, is what you're talking about, no longer sort of apply. Now, philosophers often talk about Nietzsche talking about the death of God. Nietzsche comes out with this thing like, God has died, and one of the things Nietzsche means by the death of God is the death of exactly the sort of society that regulates and controls us through sort of shame and social norms. So I guess my sense of good today, we have to work out how we relate to, how we have a sense of what the ethical might be, where it might come from, in this weirdly atomised sort of world. Now, the second part of the answer is there's a philosopher I very much admire called Emmanuel Levinas. He was a Jewish, born in Lithuania, studied philosophy in Germany with Heidegger, with Husserl, and then in France. He emigrated to France during the war, although all his family were murdered. He'd done French national service, and the Nazis didn't kill any prisoners of war who were Jewish because they were frightened of Allied reprisals. So he survived the war in a very nasty concentration camp, but not a death camp. And his philosophy is, in one sense, a response to the Holocaust and this, but also a response to this thing about modern life. And he tries to say not what ethics are, not why we should do, not what sort of things we should do, but where it might come from. And what he talks about is what he says is the face. And he says that the moment when you see another's face, you are bound up with them. And then once you're bound up with them, you can choose what to do, whether to behave well or behave badly. But it comes from this moment of being bound, being made responsible. And he says this is the core. He says, religion. The etymology of the word religion is re, meaning thing, and lingo, meaning bound. Religion's about being bound in with people. And so the origin of religion too is this being bound in with others. And that's where he says that the what underlies ethics comes from, what philosophers call meta-ethics sometimes. And where you go from that, I'm not so sure. But that sense of each of us being embodied, and a sense of us seeing each other's faces. And that's because there are complications with that, but that seems to be quite a powerful idea, I think, in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, a lot to pick up on there. I think the thing about the changes in society is that there's a certain sort of narrative of morality which is just all about decline, having lost certain values. But I think we have to appreciate the extent to which, changes in society do require changes in moral codes. Things can't be the same. I think, particularly if you think about, say, Christian ethics. Now, what Christ preached, literally speaking, was, I would argue, actually no longer really is fit for purpose in our current age. I mean, for example, because think about, you know, if you have 2 coats, give to the person who has only 1, and so forth. You know, the kind of codes about, you know, helping the stranger and so forth, these were codes that were written for a time where, as you say, people didn't travel very much. Strangers in need were relatively rare. A community could look after its, you know, few outcasts, you know, quite readily and so forth. Now, if you walk, you know, 10 yards down the street in central London, you are bombarded with people. If you were giving your duplicate clothing to everyone you saw, you would be naked after 5 yards. You know, so there's a whole kind of way of thinking about our responsibilities to others, and that kind of radical idea of, you know, treating everyone with equality, which arguably isn't even possible to the same degree now. So I think we have faced that challenge about, you know, how much a changing world actually does require fundamental changes to codes. The other thing is, and it's perhaps something I should have mentioned before, is, you know, this distinction, if there is one, between ethics and morality. Now, people make that distinction in different ways. I understand it in a fairly straightforward way, I think. You know, morality I see as being a set of rules, injunctions, whatever it might be, how to live. You know, so a code for living which sets down what you can and can't do. So fairly narrow thing. Ethics, I see, the way I see it, is a broader thing. It's the whole issue of how to live, how we should live. And you know, ethical issues aren't necessarily moral issues in the same way. So, for example, if you're trying to decide what kind of life you want to live, what would be a good life for you, it may well be that there are 2 or 3 different options, and it's not the one that is morally deficient or morally superior. It's just that they're different forms of life which have things of different value in them. I mean, I think a typical choice here might be a life which is more solitary, an individual life, which not necessarily a selfish one, but one whereby, for example, you're very much devoted to your art or creation or whatever it might be, and a life which is more community-based, engaged, and so forth. Now, they're 2 different ways of living. You have an ethical decision in terms of which you should live. That's not like a moral decision in the sense that you're not kind of wrong. You haven't done anything blameworthy that if a God exists, you should be punished for doing it if that happens. And so that idea of ethics as just how we should live, that's another thing which, you know, surely must change with changing social conditions and so forth, in a world where it's quicker to go to Madrid than it used to be to go to South London. Is a world in which sort of different ways of living are possible, and certain ways of living are no longer possible. So the whole question of how we should live changes with the time. That's all a little bit rambling, but
I have a similar, slightly different version of the different discussion between ethics and morals. So I think that's right. There is a difference between the ethics and morals, and I think I would agree with you also that morals are time, and it seems to me to be time and sort of social bound codes. So we can speak of a sort of the morality of Shakespeare's time being different from our morality. But I think I would think of ethics as being not to do with how you might want to live it, to do with a sense of doing good or doing justice. So it seems to me that ethics, or the way I understand ethics, underlie morals, but also the ethical, as it were, is the desire to do good and to do justice seems to last over time. So to use your Christian example, you know, the 2 coats are, you know, I take that absolutely, but the sense of there being justice that you have to do is an ethical thing that's true over time. But as it were, the morality, how you might do it, is going to change over time.
But
slightly different
yeah.
sort of.
Well, just sort of clarify, pick up on it. I think I see ethics, the way I described it, as being not something just separate to morality, but as being broader than that. So ethics would imply certain moral considerations, but it's more than just that. It's about the whole issue of how to live a good life, which incorporates both what we think of as being the moral and things like justice, but also things about just what it means for an individual life to go well for that person. So I think that it's a broader thing. Yeah, okay. But it's interesting, actually. I don't think there is a kind of just a definitive way of making this distinction. It's very interesting that it should be the case, isn't it? It goes back to this